The biting wind was a blade, sharp and unforgiving, slicing through the thin, inadequate layers that clung to her frozen form. She lay curled against the hard, unyielding earth, partially buried beneath a recent, cruel dusting of snow that offered no warmth, only a deepening chill that seeped into her very bones. The world was a blinding white expanse under a sky the color of bruised iron, vast and empty save for the relentless wind that seemed to howl her misery and confusion into the desolate landscape. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep weariness, a dull throb in her head, the only distinct sensation amidst the general numb agony. There was cold, and there was pain, and there was a terrifying blankness where memory should reside. Who was she? Where had she come from? The questions were formless anxieties in the fog of her mind, too large and frightening to grasp. She knew only the immediate, desperate need to escape the cold, the gnawing fear that this was the end, a quiet vanishing into the indifferent white. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, misting in the frigid air before being torn away by the wind. Her hands, stiff and blue-tinged, clutched at nothing. There was a faint, metallic taste in her mouth, the smell of damp wool and something else, blood? She couldn't be sure. Every joint screamed in protest when she tried to shift, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm her. The sheer scale of the emptiness around her pressed down, heavier than the snow, amplifying the terrifying void within. She closed her eyes, though the glare still seemed to penetrate her eyelids, focusing on the rhythm of her heart, a weak, fluttering thing. Survival felt less like a choice and more like a faint, instinctual flicker in the face of overwhelming odds. She was lost, hurt, and stripped bare of identity, left exposed to the harsh judgment of the elements. The wind whispered secrets she couldn't understand, promises of oblivion that were almost tempting in their finality. But something deep within, a spark of resilience she didn't know she possessed, refused to yield entirely. It was a faint ember, easily extinguished, but it clung stubbornly to life. The snow continued to fall, soft, silent, and deadly, slowly covering her like a shroud. The world narrowed to the sound of the wind, the feeling of ice against her skin, and the internal struggle between surrender and that fragile, persistent will to endure. There was no past, only this agonizing, frozen present, and the terrifying uncertainty of a future she couldn't envision. The cold was an antagonist in itself, relentless and cruel, seeking to erase her as effectively as the blankness in her mind. Each breath was a small victory, each beat of her heart a defiance. She didn't know who she was, but she knew with a primal certainty that she did not want to disappear, not like this, not swallowed by the indifferent white. A dark shape, indistinct at first against the monochrome landscape, began to emerge in the distance. Her frozen eyes, barely open slits, tracked its slow approach. Was it real, or a hallucination born of cold and delirium? Hope was a dangerous emotion, fragile and easily crushed in this environment, but a tiny tendril of it unfurled in her chest, tentative and uncertain. The shape grew larger, resolving into a figure on horseback, bundled against the cold. It moved with a steady, purposeful gait that bespoke familiarity with the unforgiving terrain. As it drew closer, she could discern the dark outline of a man, his face obscured by a pulled-down hat and high collar. He rode with a stillness that was almost unnerving, a part of the landscape yet distinct from it. He stopped some distance away, his horse shifting restlessly in the snow. She couldn't make out his features, but she felt the weight of his gaze upon her, a silent assessment across the desolate space. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a sudden, desperate surge of fear and hope mingling in a confusing rush. Would he leave her? Would he help? She was utterly at his mercy, a vulnerable scrap against the vastness. The man dismounted, his movements economical and deliberate. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen snow crust. She tried to speak, a raspy sound escaping her throat, but no words formed. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at her. His face was weathered, lined, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, giving away nothing. There was no immediate expression of pity or alarm, just a quiet, assessing gaze. He knelt beside her, the snow compressing beneath him. His hand, large and calloused, reached out, not to touch her, but to brush a layer of snow from her face. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet startlingly real against her frozen skin. His presence filled the small space around them, a solid, enduring force in the ephemeral world of wind and snow. She watched him through half-closed eyes, unable to decipher his intentions. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the horse's soft snorts. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. He simply looked at her, a long, searching gaze that seemed to pierce through the layers of cold and confusion. It was a look that acknowledged her presence, her plight, without sentimentality. Then, without a word, he stood up. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would leave. But he turned towards his horse. He returned with a thick wool blanket from his saddlebag. Carefully, deliberately, he unfolded it and laid it over her, tucking the edges around her. The rough wool felt like salvation against her frozen cheek. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was a barrier against the wind, a promise of future heat. He didn't speak, his silence more profound than any words could have been. He worked methodically, carefully, as if tending to a frozen sapling that might still hold life. He helped her to a sitting position, supporting her back with a strong, steady hand. Her body protested violently, pain shooting through her limbs, but the prospect of moving, of leaving this frozen deathbed, spurred her on. Getting her onto the horse was a struggle, a clumsy, painful process. He lifted her, surprisingly strong despite his lean frame, settling her across the saddle in front of him. He wrapped the blanket more securely around her, then mounted behind her, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. She was pressed against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him through the layers of fabric. It wasn't a comforting embrace, not tender, but it was undeniably protection, a shield against the relentless cold. His presence was a stark contrast to the emptiness that had surrounded her moments before. The horse began to move, slowly at first, then settling into a steady walk, heading towards a faint, dark line on the horizon that she vaguely registered as shelter. The journey was a blur of cold, pain, and the rhythmic sway of the horse. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the solid form behind her, the steady movement, and the gradual, agonizing return of feeling to her frozen limbs, a painful thawing that was almost worse than the cold itself. The man remained silent, a quiet, watchful presence. He didn't offer words of reassurance, didn't pry. He simply held the reins and guided the horse through the snow. His silence was not dismissive, but contained, a part of his nature. She leaned against him, a helpless, nameless weight, trusting him only because there was no other option. The fear of him was secondary to the fear of the elements, and her own terrifying lack of self. The void remained, but now, there was a flicker of external reality to distract from it. The biting wind, the swaying horse, the man's quiet strength. He was her anchor in this storm, a silent, unknown savior plucked from the vast, empty landscape. Her journey had ended, for now, not in oblivion, but in the hands of a stranger. The harsh world had delivered her to him, and for reasons she couldn't comprehend, he had chosen not to leave her to its mercy. She was a ghost given substance by his presence, a fragile life carried out of the white darkness. He brought her to a small, sturdy cabin nestled in a shallow ravine, partially sheltered from the worst of the wind. It was rough-hewn logs, smoke curling from the stone chimney, a stark beacon of human habitation in the wilderness. The inside was small, sparse, but blessedly warm. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and something savory cooking slowly over the hearth. He helped her dismount, his hands firm on her waist. She stumbled, weak and unsteady, and he supported her until she could stand, swaying on her own. He didn't usher her inside, didn't make a fuss. He simply opened the door and gestured with a slight tilt of his head. She stepped across the threshold into the warmth, and the difference was immediate and profound. The cold receded, replaced by a tingling, painful rush of blood returning to her extremities. She sank onto a low stool near the fire, shivering violently despite the heat. He closed the door, sealing them inside the small, quiet space. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she had observed outside, hanging his coat, gloves, and hat on pegs by the door. He then turned his attention to her. Without speaking, he knelt and gently began to unwrap the blanket from around her. His movements were careful, methodical, devoid of any unnecessary touch. He removed her frozen boots, her socks, chafing her feet gently with his large hands until some color returned to her skin. It stung, a sharp, uncomfortable pain, but it was the pain of returning life. He then carefully peeled off her outer, wet layers of clothing. She was acutely aware of his presence, his quiet competence, and her own vulnerability, stripped bare both physically and metaphorically. He handed her a thick, dry woolen shirt and trousers, rough against her skin but infinitely preferable to the freezing damp. She struggled to pull them on, her fingers stiff and clumsy. He watched her, not with impatience, but with a quiet, steady gaze. He didn't offer to help unless she faltered completely, allowing her the small dignity of dressing herself. Once she was clothed in the dry garments, he brought her a mug of something warm, tea, perhaps, or broth. It smelled faintly of herbs. He held it out to her, waiting patiently until her trembling hands could take it. She clutched the mug, the warmth seeping into her palms, and brought it to her lips. The liquid was rich and comforting, spreading warmth through her chest. She drank slowly, savoring the simple sensation of being warm and safe. He watched her, still silent, his gaze unwavering. His face was rugged, carved by the sun and wind, lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He had a strong jaw, a straight nose, and eyes that seemed to hold the quiet solitude of the land around them. His hair was dark, slightly unruly. He was not a young man, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were worn but clean, practical, and durable. He moved with the grace of someone who worked with their hands and was intimately familiar with their environment. After she had finished the drink, he took the mug from her without a word and set it aside. He then gestured towards a narrow cot in the corner of the cabin. It was piled with thick blankets. She understood. Sleep, rest. Her body was screaming for it. She stood, still unsteady, and made her way to the cot, sinking onto it with a sigh. The blankets were soft and heavy, enveloping her in warmth. He came over and carefully tucked the blankets around her, his movements still impersonal but not unkind. He didn't sit beside her, didn't offer any words of comfort. He simply ensured she was warm and settled. Then he retreated to his small table, where a single lamp cast a warm glow. He sat down and began cleaning something small and metallic, part of a trap, perhaps, or a tool. The scratching sound filled the quiet cabin, a domestic, mundane sound that was strangely comforting after the howling of the wind. She watched him through heavy eyelids. He was a man of routine, of quiet purpose. His silence wasn't awkward, but a deliberate choice, a part of his nature. There was a sense of self-sufficiency about him, an aura of quiet capability. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what happened. It was as if her past was irrelevant to the present reality of her being cold and injured on his floor. The amnesia, the void, remained, but here, in this warm cabin, it felt less like a terrifying abyss and more like a space to be filled. She didn't know who she was, but she was undeniably here, and he had brought her here. She felt a faint stir of gratitude, mixed with the lingering fear of the unknown. Who was this man? Why had he helped her? What did he expect from her? The questions circled in her mind, but they were distant, muted by the overwhelming need for sleep. She drifted off, the sound of his quiet work and the crackling fire lulling her into a deep, dreamless slumber. The first days blurred together in a haze of sleep, pain, and confusion. She woke often, disoriented, unsure of where she was. Each time, the man was there, a quiet presence in the cabin. He brought her food, simple stew, bread, water. He helped her sit up, supported her when she needed to move. He changed her bandages, cleaning the wounds she discovered on her leg and arm, deep gashes that suggested a fall, or perhaps something worse. He did it all with the same quiet competence, his hands gentle despite their roughness. He still didn't speak much. A grunt of acknowledgement, a brief instruction like drink or eat, his eyes communicated more than his words. A steady, watchful gaze that seemed to assess her condition, her unspoken needs. Her body began to heal slowly. The pain in her head subsided to a dull ache. The stiffness in her limbs eased. With physical recovery came a growing awareness of her surroundings, and of the man who shared this small space with her. The cabin was indeed sparse, but meticulously kept. Everything had its place. Tools hung neatly on the walls. A small stack of books sat on a shelf. A rifle rested in a corner. There was a sense of order and preparedness that spoke volumes about the man's character. He spent his days working. He would leave the cabin before dawn, returning at dusk, often carrying wood or game. She watched him from her cot, his movements efficient and strong. He seemed tireless, at ease with the harsh demands of his life. His face remained impassive for the most part, but sometimes, when he was working by the firelight, she would catch a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep sadness, perhaps, or a profound weariness. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, hidden behind the stoic mask. She learned his routine through observation. He ate sparingly, cleaned his dishes immediately, prepared his gear for the next day with quiet diligence. He seemed entirely self-contained, a world unto himself. Her presence was an undeniable disruption to his solitary existence. Yet he never complained, never acted put out. He simply incorporated her into his routine like another task to be managed. She still couldn't speak. The words felt locked away, inaccessible. Or perhaps she was afraid to speak, afraid of what she might reveal, or what might be expected of her. The void in her memory remained. It was a frustrating, terrifying emptiness. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to grasp at something, anything, from before. But there was nothing, just a vast, echoing blackness. Sometimes, fleeting images would flash behind her eyes, a flash of red, a sudden noise, a feeling of intense fear. But they were gone before she could make sense of them, leaving her trembling and disoriented. The man would sometimes be awake then, sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle or simply staring into the flames. He never asked what was wrong, but his quiet presence was a comfort. He didn't demand explanations she couldn't give. He simply allowed her to be. She started to walk around the cabin, testing her strength. The first few steps were shaky, but she persevered. He watched her, his gaze acknowledging her effort without comment. She began to help with small tasks, folding blankets, sweeping the dirt floor with a broom made of twigs, washing dishes. She did it partly out of a need to feel useful, and partly as a way to communicate, to show him she wasn't simply a burden. He accepted her help without fuss, occasionally giving a brief nod of approval that felt significant in its rarity. There was a quiet understanding developing between them, a communication built on shared space, shared silence, and observed actions. His silence was not empty, but seemed filled with unexpressed thoughts, with the weight of his experiences. Her silence was a cage, trapping her unknown past, but also a shield, protecting her present vulnerability. She noticed the small details of his life, the way he cared for his horse, brushing it down meticulously even in the cold, the skill with which he mended his own clothes, the deep respect he seemed to have for the land around them, taking only what he needed. He was a man in harmony with his environment, forged by its harshness. She found herself watching him, trying to decipher the mystery of him. He was a paradox, rugged and solitary, yet capable of quiet, steady care. He had saved her life, yet he remained a stranger, behind a wall of silence and self-containment. The initial fear she felt in his presence was slowly being replaced by a cautious curiosity, and something akin to respect. He was teaching her, without words, about resilience, about the quiet strength required to survive in this unforgiving place. Her physical wounds were healing, but the internal wound of her lost identity remained. Yet, here, in this small cabin with this silent man, she felt a fragile sense of safety that allowed her to exist in the present, without the crushing weight of a past she couldn't access. The world outside the cabin was still a dangerous unknown, but inside, there was order, warmth, and a quiet, enduring presence that was beginning to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a fragile, unexpected haven. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the demands of the land, and the quiet presence of the man. She continued to heal, the stiffness leaving her limbs, the aches fading. Her silence persisted, a stubborn barrier she couldn't or wouldn't break. He seemed to accept it without question, never pushing, never probing the empty spaces within her. She spent her time observing him. His name, she learned through overhearing him address his horse or refer to himself in third person while working aloud, was Silas. Silas. Fit him solid, grounded, weathered like rock. She practiced the name internally, silently, testing its feel. Silas. He was a man of habit. He rose before dawn, tended the fire, ate a simple breakfast of porridge or beans, and then headed out, regardless of the weather. He trapped, he hunted, he checked fences, he chopped wood. His days were filled with purposeful labor, demanding and solitary. She watched him through the cabin window, a small figure against the vast, white landscape, always moving, always working. There was a quiet dignity in his labor, a communion with the land that she found herself drawn to. When he returned in the evenings, tired but never complaining, he would clean his tools, tend to his injuries if he had any, and prepare their sparse meal. He ate silently, reading from one of the few worn books on his shelf by the light of the lamp. The silence between them was no longer empty or fearful, but had become a shared space, filled with the sounds of the cabin, the crackling fire, the wind outside, the quiet rustle of pages. She learned about him through his actions, through the few possessions he owned. He kept his rifle meticulously clean, a sign of respect for a vital tool. The books he read were histories and practical guides, suggesting a mind that valued knowledge and self-reliance. There were no personal mementos, no photographs, nothing to suggest a past life or connections elsewhere. He seemed as solitary as the cabin itself. Her internal world, the void of memory, remained a source of quiet distress. She would sometimes feel a pang of something, a fleeting emotion, a sense of familiarity with a certain smell or sound, but it never coalesced into a concrete memory. It was like reaching for smoke. This inability to remember was a constant, unsettling presence, a silent scream beneath the surface of her calm. But in Silas's presence, the fear was less acute. He didn't judge her lack of identity. He simply treated her as she was in the moment, a person who needed shelter, food, and time to heal. His acceptance was a quiet gift. One afternoon, a sharp blizzard blew in, trapping them indoors. The wind howled around the cabin, shaking the logs, a reminder of the world's indifference. They sat by the fire, the silence deeper than usual. Silas was mending a tear in his coat, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched his hands, strong and capable, manipulating the needle and thread with surprising dexterity. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to break the silence, to ask him something. But what? About his life? About why he lived alone? The words felt too large, too intrusive. Instead, she reached for the small pile of kindling and began to arrange it by the fire, a small, practical task. He glanced up, acknowledging her action with that brief, silent nod. Later that day, while the blizzard raged outside, a deep coughing fit racked her body. It was sudden and violent, leaving her breathless and weak. Silas immediately stopped his work and came to her side. He didn't speak, but his hand was steady on her back, waiting for the coughs to subside. When they did, he went to a shelf and retrieved a small jar. He spooned out a thick, dark substance and held it out to her. Honey, perhaps, mixed with something else. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. It was sweet and soothing, coating her raw throat. He stayed with her until her breathing eased, his presence a quiet reassurance. It was a small act of care, but it spoke volumes in their silent world. It was not pity, but a simple, practical response to her need. It was the most direct expression of concern he had shown, and it resonated deeply. In that moment, sitting by the fire while the storm raged outside, with Silas quietly ensuring her comfort, she felt a fragile sense of belonging. She was still nameless, still without a past, but she was not alone. She was here, in this small, warm cabin, cared for by a man who asked for nothing in return. The world outside was vast and dangerous, a realm of lost memories and potential threats. But within these four walls, there was a quiet strength, a shared resilience that was slowly, tentatively, building a foundation for something new. She didn't know if she would ever recover her past, but she was beginning to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, she could build a future here, in the quiet company of the man who had found her in the snow. Her internal landscape was shifting, the terrifying void slowly being encroached upon by the solid reality of her present life. The silence of her past was being filled, not by recovered memories, but by the quiet, steady presence of Silas and the routines of their shared existence. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, melting the snow in patches and bringing the first hints of green to the harsh landscape. With the changing season came a noticeable increase in her strength and mobility. She could now participate more fully in the daily chores, working alongside Silas, learning the rhythm of the ranch. She learned to fetch water from the well, split wood, tend the small garden Silas started near the cabin. Her hands, once soft and clumsy, became rough and capable, mirroring his. She moved with greater confidence, her body adapting to the demands of the life. Her silence remained, a stubborn barrier that she was beginning to resent. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to express her growing comfort and, yes, her burgeoning sense of connection to Silas and this place. But the words still felt trapped, or perhaps she was still afraid of what speaking might unleash. The void was still there, a constant, low thrum beneath her consciousness, a reminder of the part of her that was missing. Silas continued his quiet routine. He was a man of few words, his communication primarily through action and presence. He would gesture towards a task that needed doing, offer a piece of advice with a brief, clipped sentence, or express approval with a slight nod or a rare, almost imperceptible smile. His silences were not empty, but filled with a watchful awareness, a deep understanding of his environment and the needs of those within it. He seemed to see her not as a mystery to be solved, but as a person in need, capable of growth and contribution. One evening, while they were eating their simple meal, a question formed in her mind with sudden clarity. She swallowed, the food feeling thick in her throat. She looked at Silas, his face illuminated by the lamplight, calm and focused on his food. The question felt enormous, fraught with unspoken meaning. She wanted to ask him about himself, about his life before she arrived. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, driven by a silent impulse she didn't understand, she reached across the small table and gently touched the back of his hand where it rested near his plate. His hand was rough, warm, calloused. He froze for a moment, his eyes lifting to meet hers. His gaze was unreadable, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, more vulnerable. She held his gaze, unable to explain the gesture, simply letting the touch convey the questions, the burgeoning connection, the silent gratitude she felt. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken emotion. Then, slowly, carefully, he turned his hand and lightly grasped hers. His touch was firm, steady, a silent acknowledgement of her gesture, of the fragile bridge she was attempting to build across their shared silence. Neither of them spoke. The moment was brief, perhaps only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. It was a pivotal point, a shift in the dynamic between them. It wasn't a declaration, not of anything explicit, but a quiet, mutual recognition of the bond that had formed between them in the crucible of shared hardship and silent understanding. After that moment, The atmosphere in the cabin shifted subtly. Their silences remained, but they felt less like the absence of words and more like a language in themselves, a comfortable, understood space. She felt less like a guest and more like a quiet partner in the rhythm of his life. Her fear of the void remained, but it was tempered by a growing confidence in her present self, the person she was becoming in this place, with this man. She might not know her past, but she was building a present, piece by piece, with her own hands, with her quiet strength, and with the silent, steady support of Silas. The outside world was still a potential threat, a reminder of the unknown dangers that might have led her to Silas's ranch. But here, within the cabin walls, and extending now to the land they worked together, there was a growing sense of belonging, a fragile but resilient sanctuary built on shared silence and unspoken trust. The void hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her entirely. She was learning to live alongside it, to find strength in the present, in the tangible reality of the life she was building, hand in hand, silently with Silas. The growing comfort within the cabin did little to alleviate the persistent threat posed by the outside world. The void in her memory remained, a nagging reminder that her past was not simply gone, but might be actively pursuing her. Silas, despite his silence, seemed aware of this unspoken danger. His watchfulness increased, his gaze often scanning the horizon when they were outside, his rifle always close at hand. She noticed the subtle shifts in his routine, the extra caution he took when checking traps or riding the perimeter of his land. It was a silent acknowledgement of the potential for intrusion. One sweltering afternoon, while she was weeding the small garden patch, she heard the distinct sound of a horse approaching the cabin. Her heart leaped into her throat, a sudden visceral surge of fear. She dropped her trowel, her hands trembling. Silas, who had been repairing a section of fence nearby, straightened up, his body instantly tense. He didn't speak, but his hand went instinctively towards the rifle leaning against the fence post. They both watched as a lone rider emerged from the treeline, heading towards the cabin. He was a stranger, his appearance rough and unkempt, his eyes darting restlessly across the property. He rode with an air of predatory purpose that sent a chill down her spine. Silas moved swiftly, quietly, gesturing for her to get behind him. He picked up his rifle, holding it loosely but ready. The rider approached the cabin and pulled his horse to a stop a short distance away. He didn't dismount, his gaze fixed on Silas, then flicking towards her, a calculating look in his eyes that made her skin crawl. "Afternoon," the stranger called out, his voice raspy and unpleasant. "Lookin' for something?" Silas remained silent, his eyes steady on the rider. His stance was defensive, protective. "Ain't seen nothin'," Silas replied, his voice low and gravelly, a stark contrast to the stranger's grating tone. "Maybe you have," the rider persisted, a thin smile spreading across his face. "Heard tell of a woman seen wanderin' this way some time back. Lookin' for her. Got a price on her head." The words landed like stones, shattering the fragile peace they had built. Price on her head. It explained the void, the fear, the sense of being hunted. Confirmed the danger. She froze behind Silas, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know who she was or what she had done, but the chilling implication was clear. Silas didn't flinch. His gaze remained unwavering. "Ain't no woman here," he stated flatly. The lie was simple, direct, and delivered with an air of quiet finality that was more convincing than any elaborate denial. The stranger's smile widened slightly, his eyes narrowed. "You sure 'bout that, friend? Wouldn't want you hidin' something valuable." He glanced towards her again, his gaze lingering with an unnerving intensity. Silas shifted almost imperceptibly, the movement drawing the stranger's attention back to him. "I'm sure," Silas said, his voice hardening just slightly. "Now, state your business or ride on." The air crackled with tension. The stranger hesitated, clearly weighing Silas's quiet determination against his own predatory instincts. He was used to intimidation, but Silas was not easily intimidated. There was a quiet strength in him that pushed back against the stranger's aggression. After a long moment, the rider seemed to make a decision. He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. All right, no need for hackles. Just a skin around. He pulled on his reins. Keep your eyes peeled, though. Rewards hefty. With a final, lingering glance at her, he turned his horse and rode away, back the way he came, disappearing into the trees. They didn't move until the sound of his horse faded completely. The silence that followed was different from their usual quietude. It was heavy with unspoken danger, with the weight of the confirmed threat. Silas finally lowered his rifle, but he didn't put it away. He turned to her, his expression still unreadable. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and a desperate, silent question. He had lied for her, protected her without hesitation. He knew now that she was hunted, that there was danger attached to her very existence, yet he had not turned her away. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and assessing. In that moment, without a single word exchanged, their bond solidified. The tentative trust had been tested by the outside world and had held firm. She might be nameless, hunted, and without a past, but in Silas's eyes, she was worth protecting. The external threat had brought their internal, unspoken connection to the surface, forging it into something stronger and more defined. The threat lingered in the air like the scent of smoke. The stranger or others like him might return. Her past was a shadow, reaching out to claim her. But now, she faced it not alone, but with Silas. The decision had been made, not in words, but in the quiet, resolute actions of a man who had chosen to stand by the nameless woman he found in the snow. The days that followed were charged with a new kind of tension. The quiet routines of ranch life were now underscored by a heightened sense of vigilance. Silas reinforced the cabin door, checked his rifle more often, and taught her how to load and fire it. She was a quick study, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear that still ran through her. She practiced in secret, away from Silas, the loud report of the gun a stark contrast to the silence she carried within her. It was a skill born of necessity, a tool for survival in a world that wanted to reclaim her. The void in her memory felt heavier now, weighted by the knowledge that whatever lay hidden there was dangerous. Who was she that someone would hunt her with a price on her head? Was she a criminal? A victim? The uncertainty was agonizing, but the fear of discovering the truth was even greater. She clung to the present, to the tangible reality of her life with Silas, to the strength she felt growing within her. One evening, sitting by the fire, she felt the urge to speak again, stronger this time. The silence felt suffocating, a barrier between her and the man who had risked everything for her. She looked at Silas, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, his gaze lost in the fire. She took a deep breath, and the words, halting and rusty, finally emerged from her throat. They will come back." Her voice was a dry rasp, unfamiliar and strange even to her own ears. Silas's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't look surprised, only watchful. He waited. "The man," he said. "Price?" She continued, the words coming slowly, laboriously, like stones being pulled from deep water. On my head, Silas nodded, his expression grim. I heard him. He didn't ask what the price was for or who they were. He simply accepted the reality of the situation. "I don't know. Why?" she whispered, the frustration and fear evident in her voice. "I don't know who I am." It was the first time she had ever articulated the core of her distress, the terrifying blankness at the center of her being. Silas was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. There was no pity there, but a deep, quiet understanding. "It don't matter," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Who you were matters who you are now." The simple words resonated deeply, striking a chord within her she hadn't known was there. It didn't matter who she was. It mattered who she was now. Now, she was a woman who had survived the snow, who had learned to split wood and load a rifle, who was forging a new identity in the crucible of this harsh land, with this quiet, steady man. But what if I did something bad? The question was tentative, filled with apprehension. The possibility was a heavy weight she had carried in the silent spaces of her mind. Silas held her gaze. "Everyone's got a past," he said, his voice still quiet. "Some got more shadows than others." He paused, then added, "Matters what you do now." His words were not absolution but acceptance. He wasn't asking for confession or explanation. He was offering a chance for the present, a chance to define herself by her actions here and now, rather than by a past she couldn't remember. Her voice, once broken, grew slightly stronger. "Why? Why did you help me? Why didn't you leave me?" Silas looked back at the fire for a moment, then returned his gaze to her. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Didn't seem right," he said simply. "Leavin' someone out there." Not like that. It was a simple explanation, devoid of grand gestures or heroic pronouncements, but it was profoundly moving in its quiet humanity. He had acted out of a fundamental sense of decency, a refusal to leave a fellow human being to die in the wilderness. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and something else, something warm and fragile. She had finally spoken, broken the silence that had held her captive. And he had responded not with judgment or fear, but with quiet acceptance and a pragmatic focus on the present. The threat of her past remained, lurking at the edges of their isolated world. But now, they faced it together, two solitary figures bound by shared silence, shared hardship, and the quiet strength of a bond forged in the face of oblivion. She was still a woman with no name, no memory, but she was no longer defined solely by the void. She was defined by her present, by her resilience, and by the man who saw her not for who she might have been, but for who she was becoming. The fragile sanctuary had become stronger, fortified by the unspoken understanding that had finally found voice. The silence between them was not gone, but transformed, now a space for shared understanding, punctuated by words that carried the weight of their shared experience. The external threat materialized with brutal suddenness. It was a cold, clear morning, the kind that felt deceptively peaceful. Silas was outside, checking his traps near the tree line. She was inside the cabin, starting the fire. A sharp crack, too loud and distinct to be anything but a rifle shot, shattered the quiet air. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled to the window, her heart pounding. She saw Silas drop to the ground, scrambling for cover behind a thicket of brush. Then she saw them, two riders emerging from the trees, heading towards him. They were the stranger from before, and another man equally rough-looking. They dismounted and advanced cautiously, rifles in hand, fanning out to cut off Silas's escape. He was outnumbered and exposed. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a fierce protectiveness for the man who had saved her. A surge of adrenaline that cleared her mind. She didn't hesitate. She ran to the corner where Silas kept his rifle, the one he had taught her to use. Her hands fumbled for a second, then grasped it, hefting its familiar weight. She checked the chamber loaded, just as he kept it. She took a deep breath, the unfamiliar weight of the weapon grounding her. She moved to the front door, peering out through a crack in the logs. Silas was pinned down, returning fire sparingly, conserving his ammunition. The two men were advancing steadily. She had to act. There was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. There was only the immediate, desperate need to help Silas. She threw open the cabin door and stepped out, raising the rifle to her shoulder. The cold air hit her face, sharp and bracing. The two men stopped, startled by her sudden appearance. The stranger's eyes widened in recognition, a look of surprise and greed flashing across his face. "Well, looky here," he snarled. The woman herself, and armed, too. Silas, seeing her, yelled something she couldn't make out over the wind, his voice sharp with alarm. He didn't want her exposed, but she knew she couldn't hide. Not now. Not when he was in danger because of her. She aimed the rifle, remembering Silas's quiet instructions. Steady the barrel, sight down the line, control your breath. She focused on the man who had come with the stranger. He was closer, easier target. She squeezed the trigger, The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report deafening. Dust kicked up near the man's feet as the shot went wide. Her aim was off, but the distraction was enough. The man ducked, surprised by the return fire from the cabin. Silas seized the opportunity, rolling to a new position behind a fallen log, giving him a better angle. "Get inside!" Silas yelled, his voice hoarse. But she didn't move. She fumbled with the rifle, trying to reload, her fingers clumsy with urgency. The stranger recovered quickly, raising his own rifle. He aimed at her. Time seemed to slow. She saw the intent in his eyes, the glint of the sun on his rifle barrel. She knew she was exposed, a clear target. But she didn't flinch. She had come too far, survived too much to crumble now. Before the stranger could fire, Silas's rifle cracked. The stranger cried out, staggering back, dropping his weapon. He clutched his shoulder, blood blooming darkly on his coat. His companion, seeing his partner hit and surprised by the unexpected resistance, hesitated for a crucial second. Silas fired again, his aim true this time. The second man fell, not moving. The stranger, wounded and alone, looked from his fallen companion to Silas, then to her, standing defiant with the rifle in her hands. His face twisted with rage and fear. He turned and ran, scrambling towards his horse, leaving his partner's body behind. Silas emerged from cover, his rifle still trained on the retreating figure. The stranger mounted his horse and spurred it into a desperate gallop, disappearing back into the trees. Silence descended once more, but it was a charged, ringing silence, filled with the echoes of gunfire and the scent of powder. Silas stood still for a moment, scanning the tree line, ensuring the threat was gone. Then he turned and walked towards her, his gaze fixed on her face. She lowered the rifle, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had begun to recede. She looked from the dead man on the ground to Silas, then back to the cabin. She had stood her ground. She had fought. She had, for the first time, actively participated in her own survival and in the protection of the man who had protected her. Silas reached her side. He didn't speak, didn't ask why she hadn't stayed inside. He simply looked at her, a long, steady gaze that held a mixture of relief, respect, and something that looked like pride. He took the rifle gently from her hands. "You didn't run," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with the weight of the moment. It wasn't a question, but an observation, an acknowledgement of her courage. "No," she replied, her voice stronger now, steady despite the lingering tremor in her hands. "I didn't run in that moment, standing side by side amidst the aftermath of violence. The void in her memory felt less important than the tangible reality of her present, of the strength she had found, and of the quiet partnership that had been forged in the face of death. The external threat had forced her to confront not her past, but her present capabilities, proving that the woman she was becoming was strong, resilient, and capable of fighting for what she valued. The immediate danger receded, leaving behind a stark silence broken only by the wind and the quiet aftermath of violence. The body of the fallen man lay in the snow, a grim testament to the intrusion of the outside world. Silas moved with grim efficiency, dealing with the practicalities of the situation. She watched him, her own body trembling from the lingering effects of adrenaline, her mind trying to process what had just happened. She had faced the threat, not from the shadows, but head-on, and she had survived. More importantly, she had fought alongside Silas, a partner in survival. As Silas worked, his movements deliberate and focused, she sat on the steps of the cabin, the cold seeping into her clothes, but feeling strangely numb to it. The void in her memory was still there, a silent backdrop, but it no longer felt like the most important thing about her. The roar of the rifle, the tension of the confrontation, the look in Silas's eyes, these felt more real, more defining, than any lost memory. When Silas was finished, he came and sat beside her on the steps, his presence a solid anchor in the aftermath. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. It was a silence of shared experience, of mutual understanding that had transcended words. He didn't ask about her past, didn't press her about the price on her head. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the stranger had disappeared. After a long while, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate to express the depth of her gratitude. He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. "Didn't do it for thanks," he replied, his voice low. "Did what needed doing." It was typical of him, understated, pragmatic. But she knew it was more than that. He had risked his life for her, for a woman with no name and a dangerous past. He knew who I was," she said, wrestling with the implications of the stranger's recognition. "Or what I was." Silas nodded slowly. "Seems so. Do you think he'll come back?" The question was filled with apprehension. Silas looked towards the tree line again. "Maybe not. He's wounded. Might be enough for now," he paused, then added. "But others might come. If that price is high enough." The reality was stark. The threat wasn't necessarily gone, only temporarily pushed back. Her past would continue to reach for her. She looked at the ground, a wave of despair threatening to wash over her. What kind of life was this, constantly looking over her shoulder, a burden and a danger to the man who had saved her? Silas reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the step. His touch was warm and firm. "We'll face it," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Together, the simple word, together, spoken by this solitary man, felt profoundly powerful. It was an offer of partnership, of shared burden, a promise of resilience in the face of an uncertain future. In that moment, the terrifying void in her memory seemed less important than the solid reality of Silas's presence, his quiet strength, and the bond they had forged. She might not know her name or where she came from, but she knew where she was now, and she knew she was not alone. The events of the day, the violence and the fear, had stripped away the last layers of her passive vulnerability. She had fought, she had chosen to stand with Silas, and in doing so, she had claimed her present. She was no longer just a woman found in the snow, a mystery with a price on her head. She was a woman who had faced death and chosen to live, a woman with resilience etched into her soul by the harshness of the land and the quiet strength of the man beside her. The void in her memory might remain, a scar from a past she couldn't touch, but it no longer defined her. She was defined by the present, by the life she was building, and by the silent, unwavering partnership she had found in this remote, unforgiving place. The name she had lost seemed less important now. She was becoming someone new, someone strong and capable, defined by her actions and her connection to Silas. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow. The world remained vast and indifferent, but within the small circle of their shared space, there was a quiet strength, a resilient hope forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The external world had brought danger, but it had also solidified their bond, proving that even in the face of oblivion, connection and resilience could flourish. The days following the confrontation settled into a new kind of peace, one that was watchful but also deeply rooted. The threat hadn't vanished entirely, but it felt less immediate, held at bay by Silas's vigilance and the clear message they had sent to any who might be looking for her. Life on the ranch returned to its rhythm of work and quietude, but with an added layer of unspoken understanding between them. She continued to help Silas with the ranch work, her skills growing with each passing day. She could now handle the horse with confidence, repair fences alongside him, and track small game. The physical labor was demanding, but it grounded her, connecting her to the land and to the tangible reality of her present existence. Her voice, once hesitant and rusty, became stronger, though their dialogue remained sparse, filled with the economy of people who communicate more through action and shared presence than through words. She still didn't have a name or memories that stretched back before the snow, but the absence felt less like a gaping wound and more like a quiet, private space within her. The woman with no name was forging a new identity, defined by her resilience, her capability, and her connection to Silas. One evening, while sharing their meal by the fire, she looked at Silas, his face weathered and calm in the soft light. "Silas," she said, his name feeling comfortable on her tongue. He looked at her, waiting. "My name," she began, hesitating. The void stretched behind her, silent and empty. But the present was full. The cabin, the land, Silas's quiet presence, her own newfound strength. These were her reality. "I don't remember it," she said, stating the fact without the terror it once held. "But, I think, I want a new one." Silas regarded her steadily. He didn't question, didn't push. "A new name," he repeated quietly. "What name?" She thought for a moment, looking around the cabin, at the solid logs, the enduring stone hearth, the quiet strength of the man across from her. The land outside, harsh but beautiful. "Rose," she said finally, the name coming to her unexpectedly, like a fragile bloom pushing through hard ground. Or maybe, something strong, like the mountains. Silas nodded slowly, considering. "Rose," he said, testing the name. "It's a good name." He paused. "Has thorns?" A faint smile touched his lips, a rare sight that transformed his rugged face. It was a perfect description: beauty and resilience, fragility and strength. She smiled back, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she agreed softly. Thorns. It was not about recovering the past, but about claiming the present, about choosing who she wanted to be. From that moment on, Silas called her Rose. It felt right, a name that belonged to the woman she was becoming. The external threat, though still a possibility, seemed less terrifying now. They had faced it together, and they were stronger for it. Rose found a quiet sense of peace settling within her. She didn't need to remember the shadows of her past to know her worth, or to understand the bond she shared with Silas. Their connection was not built on shared history, but on shared survival, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding forged in silence and hardship. They were two solitary souls who had found unexpected companionship in a lonely world. The ranch, once just a place of shelter, became their home, a sanctuary built not just of logs and stone, but of trust, resilience, and the quiet strength of their partnership. The journey had begun in darkness and confusion, in the terrifying void of a lost identity. But through the quiet strength of a silent man and the harsh lessons of the wilderness, she had found not just survival, but a new self, a new name, and a reason to embrace the present, leaving the past, whatever it held, behind. She was Rose, a woman shaped by the land, tempered by hardship, and grounded by the quiet, enduring presence of Silas. Their life was not easy. The world outside was still full of potential dangers, but they faced it together, two resilient figures standing strong against the vast, indifferent sky. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken affection, mutual respect, and the quiet certainty of a shared future built on the solid foundation of their present reality. Her reason to remember was not a specific event or a lost name, but the strength she had found, the life she had built, and the quiet, profound connection that had given her a reason to live, to be, and to face whatever the future held, together. Rose. The name was a quiet affirmation, a symbol of resilience blooming in the wilderness. Their life together settled into a rhythm of shared work and comfortable silence. The fear of the past, though never entirely absent, receded into the background, a distant echo against the solid reality of their present. They expanded the garden, added more livestock, their efforts slowly shaping the land around them. Rose learned to ride and shoot with greater skill, her movements confident and capable. Silas watched her transformation with quiet satisfaction, his rare nods and brief words of approval meaning more to her than effusive praise from others ever could. Their connection deepened, a bond forged not through grand declarations, but through shared sunrises and sunsets, the mutual relief after a storm, the quiet moments of rest by the fire. There was a comfortable intimacy in their shared space, a silent acknowledgement of their dependence on each other. She didn't need to understand his past any more than he needed to understand hers. Their present was enough. The void in her memory remained, a quiet room she rarely entered, but it no longer defined her. She was defined by the calluses on her hands, the strength in her legs, the quiet resilience in her spirit, and the warmth in her chest whenever Silas was near. She had found her identity not in remembering, but in living. One cold autumn evening, as the wind howled around the cabin, a sound reached them that was distinct from the storm, the whinny of a horse, nearby. Both of them stiffened, instantly on alert. Silas reached for his rifle, his eyes meeting Rose's in the dim light. No words were needed. The threat was here. Footsteps crunched on the frozen ground outside. A voice, rough and unfamiliar, called out, "Anyone in there? Needs shelter from the storm." It was a common enough plea in this country, but after the earlier threat, they were wary. Silas gestured for Rose to stay back, moving quietly towards the door, rifle ready. He opened it a crack, peering out. A man stood hunched against the wind, his horse nearby. He was bundled heavily, his face obscured by a scarf. "Got room for two?" the man asked, his voice strained. "My partner's hurt bad." Silas hesitated. Refusing shelter in a storm like this was akin to a death sentence. But the potential danger. Rose moved silently to stand beside Silas, holding her own rifle, though it was hidden from the view of the man outside. Silas's gaze flickered to her, a silent question passing between them. She met his eyes, her expression calm and resolute. They faced threats together. He nodded, a subtle movement. He couldn't leave a wounded man to die. "All right," Silas said, his voice flat. "Bring him in." He opened the door wider, allowing the man to lead a second figure, slumped heavily over a horse, into the small clearing. As they got closer, the storm-driven scarf on the first man's face slipped. Rose's breath caught. It was the stranger from before, the one Silas had wounded, and the slumped figure on the horse. As the stranger pulled his partner off the horse, the partner's head lolled back. Rose saw his face in the dim light from the cabin. A jolt, sharp and painful, shot through her. Recognition, sudden and visceral. Not a memory, not a gentle recall, but a shock of terror and familiarity that shook her to the core. The man was one of them, one of the men from before. Before the snow, before the void. The stranger looked up, seeing Rose clearly for the first time in the light. His eyes widened in surprised recognition, then narrowed with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You!" he snarled, his hand going towards a pistol tucked into his belt. But Silas was faster. His rifle was up, aimed directly at the stranger. "Don't," Silas said, his voice like ice. The stranger froze, his hand hovering inches from his weapon. He looked from Silas to Rose, standing resolute beside him with her own rifle hidden, but her stance clear. "You hit her?" The stranger spat at Silas. "There's a high price on her." Silas didn't lower his rifle. "Get your partner inside," he ordered, his gaze hard. "He needs tending. Then we'll talk." The stranger hesitated. Then, driven by the desperation of the storm and his partner's condition, he reluctantly began to drag the injured man towards the cabin. Rose watched, her heart hammering, the shock of partial recognition echoing through her. The man Silas had killed, this wounded man. They were connected to her lost past. But the fear was different now. It was tempered by the strength she had found, and by the unwavering presence of Silas beside her. They were no longer just surviving. They were facing the past, head-on, together. The cabin that had been her sanctuary was about to become a battleground, or perhaps a place of reckoning. The void had not been filled by gentle memory, but by the stark, dangerous reality of the past crashing into her present. But she was not the same woman who had been found in the snow. She was Rose, and she was ready. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension. The wounded man, pale and clearly suffering, lay on the cot, his breathing shallow. The stranger, his arm crudely bandaged by Silas, sat by the fire, his eyes darting between Silas and Rose. Silas moved calmly, tending to the injured man's wound with practiced hands, his rifle within easy reach. Rose stood near the door, the shotgun Silas had given her earlier held loosely but purposefully. She watched the stranger, her gaze steady. The shock of recognizing the wounded man, of knowing he was connected to her past, had subsided, leaving behind a cold clarity. She didn't remember specifics, names, events, but she knew they were from the world she had escaped, a world of danger and pursuit. "He's lost a lot of blood," Silas said, looking at the stranger. "Needs proper care." If he's to live, the stranger's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, fear for his partner, resentment towards Silas, and a lingering predatory glint when he looked at Rose. "Who is she?" the stranger demanded, his voice hoarse. "Why's she here?" Silas glanced at Rose, a silent communication passing between them. "She needed help," Silas replied simply. "And you?" the stranger pressed, looking at Silas with suspicion. "You just happened to find her? Don't you know who she is? What she did?" The stranger looked at Rose. "They're looking for you high and low. You think you can just disappear?" He laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Not from him," he gestured towards his wounded partner. "He never forgets." Rose remained silent, her gaze fixed on the stranger. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a quiet determination. She wouldn't let him intimidate her. She wouldn't let her past reclaim her. Silas finished tending to the wounded man as best he could. He stood up, facing the stranger. "The storm's passin'," Silas said, his voice low. "Come mornin'. You take him and go." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "And her? You think you can just keep her? She's worth a fortune. She's not yours to claim." Rose spoke, her voice clear and steady, surprising the stranger. Her voice had returned, strong and resonant. She had found it in the silence, in the strength she had built. The stranger stared at her, taken aback by her composure, by the strength in her eyes. "You don't even know who you are," he sneered. "You think you can just start over? The past catches up. Maybe," Rose replied, her gaze unwavering. "But the present matters more." She looked at Silas, a shared understanding passing between them. "This is my present, and I'll fight for it." Silas stood beside her, his presence a silent, powerful affirmation of her words. His gaze was locked on the stranger, daring him to make a move. The tension in the cabin was palpable. The stranger was trapped by the storm, by his wounded partner, and by the quiet, unyielding resolve of Silas and Rose. He saw the strength in them, the bond that had formed, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that taking her wouldn't be easy, maybe wouldn't be possible. He looked at his wounded partner, then back at Rose and Silas. The bounty, the pursuit, suddenly seemed less important than the immediate reality of their defiance. He muttered a curse under his breath. "All right," he said grudgingly. "We'll go." Soon as he can move, the rest of the night was long and tense. Silas and Rose took turns keeping watch, their gazes constantly on the two men. There was little sleep for anyone. With the first light of dawn, the storm had indeed passed. The air was crisp and cold. The stranger, his face etched with exhaustion and defeat, helped his still weak partner onto the horse. He cast a final, venomous look at Rose, then at Silas. "This ain't over," he muttered, a promise and a threat. Silas didn't reply, his rifle still held ready. The two men rode away, disappearing into the vast landscape. Silence returned to the cabin, but it was a silence of relief, of victory hard won. Rose and Silas looked at each other. There were no grand pronouncements, no emotional embraces, just a long, shared gaze that spoke volumes. She had faced a piece of her past, and she had not only survived, but had stood her ground, protected her present, and found her voice. Silas walked over to her, his eyes soft. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. "Rose," he said, her name a quiet affirmation. It wasn't about the void, about the lost past. It was about her, the woman who stood before him, strong and resilient. The external conflict had forced her to confront her deepest fears, not of what she might have done, but of being perpetually defined and hunted by it. But in standing with Silas, in finding her voice and her courage, she had broken free. The past was a shadow, but the present was real, tangible, and hers to claim. The journey from a nameless, frozen figure to Rose, a woman with strength and a name chosen from the wilderness, was complete. The void in her memory was still there, a quiet reminder of a past she couldn't fully touch, but it no longer held power over her. She had found her identity not in recollection, but in resilience, in connection, and in the quiet strength of building a life from scratch. The world outside remained vast and often cruel, but within the walls of the small cabin, and across the land they worked together, there was a profound sense of belonging, a resilient partnership forged in silence, hardship, and the quiet courage to face whatever the future held, together. Her reason to remember was not the trauma that had brought her here, but the life she had built, the strength she had found, and the quiet, enduring bond with the man who had given her shelter, protection, and a reason to finally speak her own name. She was Rose, a woman of the wild, with thorns and beauty, resilience and strength, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find hope and connection even in the most desolate of landscapes. The harsh land had tested her, the past had tried to claim her, but she had stood firm, and in the quiet, steady presence of Silas, she had found a reason to remember not who she was, but who she had become.